In the silent hills of Vermont, where winters seem eternal and maple trees hold ancient secrets, lived Maggie Sullivan, a 70-year-old widow who had learned to live with the echo. Her life was filled with the simple rituals of the farm, lighting the fire at dawn, making black coffee without sugar, and listening to the creaking of the old wood under her feet. Since the death of Harold, her husband of 47 years, the world had become smaller and more predictable. She used to think that grief would eventually wither like the flowers on her porch, but she realized that mourning doesn't go away. It simply settles, like a permanent shadow on the side of routine. That Tuesday began like any other. The wind blew through the cracks in the windows and the smell of toast filled the kitchen. Maggie washed the dishes with mechanical patience, watching the warm water cloud with traces of flour. Then she heard it, an insistent buzz, almost like the beat of a hidden heart. It was a phone, vibrating on the table. Turning, she saw a lavender case with a gold butterfly, her granddaughter Rachel's cell phone. The young woman had left it there the previous weekend. Maggie smiled, thinking it would give her an excuse to visit soon. But when the screen lit up with a message from a contact named T, the air in the room seemed to freeze. The text, brief and devastating, read, "Tuesday again, same time. I'm counting down the minutes until I can hold you." Maggie held the phone with clammy hands, unable to tear her eyes away from the sentence. Those words weren't just a romantic refrain, but a promise steeped in habit, in repetition. Tuesday again. Tuesday again. How many Tuesdays had passed since Harold died, and how many of those days had kept secrets? At first, she thought the message wasn't addressed to Rachel, that perhaps it was a mix-up, a mistake in the number. But then she saw the photo on the notification. It was Harold. His face was smiling, younger than she remembered, wearing a purple shirt she'd never seen him wear. It was as if time were bending in front of her, as if death were mocking her memory. Her breathing became labored. She dried her hands on her apron and, trembling, unlocked her phone. She didn't quite know why she was doing it. She only felt the urge to understand. Inside, she found an endless history of messages, conversations going back years. She soon discovered that T wasn't the sender, but an initial used to hide another name, a digital disguise. Between words of love, photographs, and promises, Maggie began to piece together pieces she didn't want to see. Her husband and daughter-in-law had been having a secret relationship on their own farm, under her same roof. The screen shone like an open wound, and she, standing in front of the fogged-up window, felt her whole body suddenly age. For a few minutes, Maggie remained motionless, holding the phone in her hands like a piece of ice. Outside, the landscape remained the same. The frost-covered fields, the sleeping barn, the smoke from the chimney rising straight into the icy air. But inside her, something broke with a dull, invisible sound. It wasn't just betrayal she felt. It was the most intimate humiliation, the discovery that everything that had sustained her life, love, family, routine, had been a carefully constructed stage set to hide the lie. In the photographs, she recognized the old barn, the floral sheets in the bedroom she shared with Harold, the shirt he wore to Sunday Mass, and beside him Rachel, smiling with unbearable familiarity. She didn't cry, not a tear. Crying, she thought, was for those who still had the strength to feel compassion. What came over her was a strange, almost mechanical calm. She poured another coffee, sat down at the table, and began to pore over each message, as if analyzing a medical file. There were the times, the places, the dates, references to meetings on the farm, to keeping it a secret so the old lady wouldn't notice. The old lady, that's what they called her. Harold had died 5 months after the last photo. A heart attack, they said then. But now, as the pieces fell into place with a terrifying sound, Maggie realized that nothing in that story had been natural. That night, the clock struck 10 as Maggie sat by the phone. She'd spent hours reading every word, every photo, every silence between messages. It was like listening to a conversation between ghosts who should never have existed. Suddenly, a detail caught her attention. In one of the conversations, Rachel mentioned making sure the policy is signed before the anniversary. The phrase sounded distant yet familiar. Harold had insisted on reviewing her insurance policies shortly before he died, something that had seemed harmless at the time, almost responsible. Now she understood that precaution had another purpose, and the worst part was that Rachel, with her sweet tone and impeccable smile, had been there the whole time, helping her. Grieve for a man they both knew was guilty. When her phone started to run out of battery, Maggie plugged it into the charger and put it in a metal cookie tin, the kind her husband used to store screws. She knew Rachel would come back the next day looking for it. She had to think fast. Fake it. Pretend normal. That word became her shield. She made breakfast, cleaned the house, and left the box on the table as if nothing had happened. When Rachel arrived, with her rehearsed voice of innocence, Maggie barely looked up. She handed the phone back to her with a dry smile and a simple sentence. "Don't worry, darling, I was safe." But behind that gesture, an idea began to grow in her mind. Something silent, cold, and precise, like a winter seed. That night, after Rachel left, Maggie turned on the lamp on Harold's desk. The smell of wood and dust seemed to contain everything: the years, the letters, the absences. In a drawer, she found the old life insurance papers. There was a policy in both. Their names, but the dates didn't match what she remembered. The contract number was different, and Harold's signature seemed shakier, less natural. It was then that she realized someone had tampered with the papers. Rachel worked at the local accounting office. She had access, knew how to move numbers and falsified documents without leaving a trace. What Maggie didn't know was how deep this deception went, or who else was involved. The next morning, a gray car pulled up in front of the farmhouse. Two officers got out, expressions neutral, and behind them a woman in a long coat with a steady gaze, Detective Morrison. Her voice was polite, almost kind, but each word weighed like a sentence. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to ask you some questions about your husband's death." Maggie felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. The detective explained that they had received an anonymous tip alleging that Harold had been poisoned out of jealousy, and that she, Maggie, had financial motives for doing it. She didn't understand anything, until the detective mentioned the policy, $500,000, with her as the beneficiary. Maggie didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Everything fit too well to be a coincidence. The farm, which had always been her refuge, began to feel like a prison. Every corner seemed to eye her with suspicion. Detective Morrison returned twice more that week, asking increasingly pointed questions. Had she noticed anything strange about Harold's food? Where was his medication kept? Who had access to his bank account? Maggie answered calmly, but inside she felt her world crumble. Michael, her son, traveled from Burlington as soon as he found out. His face was tense, confused, somewhere between doubt and defense. "Mom, tell me you didn't do anything." She didn't blame him. She knew the story was designed to make him doubt, too. That was the cruelest thing about deception. It separated people before destroying them. That night, mother and son went through the folders Harold had left behind together. Among the bills and receipts, they found a doctored copy of the insurance policy, the supposed Harold Sullivan Memorial Trust, a name neither of them had heard before. Michael, who had worked in banking for a time, noticed something disturbing. The fund was managed by Tom Sullivan, his cousin and Harold's nephew, a man they rarely saw at family gatherings. Tom had always been charming and calculating, the kind of person who knew how to say the right thing without ever showing what he thought. Next to him, another name appeared on the document: Rachel, his own wife, listed as a special consultant. Maggie felt a chill. The blow was bigger than she imagined. Michael, his breath ragged, clutched his head. "It can't be," he muttered. "She wouldn't do something like that." But the evidence was right in front of him. printed on legal paper with both traders' signatures. Maggie said nothing. She just watched as her son went through the same disbelief she'd felt days before. In the back of her mind, however, a thread of logic began to form. Rachel and Tom had set up the trust to keep the insurance money, and when Harold died, they made sure the payout wouldn't reach his rightful heir. It had all been planned. And now, with the complaint, they were looking to take away the only thing he had left: his name. Days passed, and Maggie barely slept. In the shadows of dawn, she replayed every Rachel's gesture, every phrase she'd spoken. At the funeral, every calculated hug. Everything took on a new meaning. It was then that she decided she wouldn't be a silent victim. If they had played at manipulation, she would play at anticipation. At the same desk where Harold wrote his accounts, she began to plan. She took notes, organized dates, exchanged messages and details. She wasn't in a hurry. She knew that patience was her best ally. And right in that process of apparent calm, while she was reviewing the photos on her phone, she noticed something else, a reference to T that didn't match Tom. There was another name hidden in that tangle. Maggie zoomed in on one of the images and discovered a shadow reflected in the barn mirror. It was indeed Tom, but not only him. In the messages, T also appeared at later dates after Harold was already dead. This meant that Rachel and Tom had continued their relationship after burying the man who had secretly bonded with them. Maggie felt a mixture of repulsion and clarity. Everything made sense. The messages spoke of new transfers, a backup plan, and keeping the old lady distracted. It was at that moment, as she closed her phone and watched nightfall on the farm, that she considered how many people, silently, must have felt that burning betrayal in their hearts. If you've ever discovered a truth that changed you forever, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening to this from. Some stories only heal when they're shared. The next day, with a calm face but a fervent mind, Maggie went to the local bank. She knew Rachel managed the accounting for several companies and could have used contacts to falsify records. The manager, an older woman named Eunice, treated her cautiously. Maggie explained that she needed to review the transactions on Harold's joint account. Eunice, who had known her all her life, accessed it after hours. What they found was chilling. 3 transfers made out to the Memorial Trust weeks before Harold's death, all digitally authorized from Rachel's computer. Maggie needed no further confirmation. Now she had a purpose: to uncover the whole truth, even if she had to face hell empty-handed. That night, the wind battered the windows with an almost human fury. Maggie, sitting by the fire, reviewed the documents Eunice had printed for her. Each figure was a dagger, but also a clue. There was no doubt. Rachel and Tom had moved the money months in advance, anticipating every step. They had slowly poisoned Harold, manipulating his weakening heart with doses of digoxin, until they caused a heart attack no one would question. Maggie remembered her husband's tired face, the dizziness, the nausea they attributed to age. It had all been right in front of her, disguised as routine. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel sadness. She sensed strategy. A new fire was beginning to ignite inside her. The plan she began to form wasn't born out of hatred, but out of an instinct to survive. She knew the police still considered her a suspect, so she needed irrefutable evidence. That same week, she wrote an anonymous letter to Tom, posing as a blackmailer. She told him she knew about the murder, the fraud, and the forgery, and demanded hush money. She worded it precisely, using words only someone inside the crime scene would understand. She sent it from a post office in another city. Then she waited. She didn't sleep, barely ate, but every day she felt she was getting closer to something. And when the phone rang that afternoon, with Tom's voice on the other end saying her full name, she knew the game was on. Tom didn't sound surprised. His tone was calm, too calm, as if he were speaking to someone he'd already planned to eliminate. "I know it's you, Maggie," he said with blood-curdling calm. "If you think you can ruin what we built, you're wrong. You don't know who you're messing with." Then he mentioned Ethan, Maggie's grandson, implying that the boy might have an accident if she didn't cooperate. The threat was so direct that for a moment the old woman felt the ground shift beneath her feet. But she also understood something essential. If Tom was calling her, it was because he was scared. The blackmail had touched a real wound. And in the fear of the guilty, Maggie found her advantage. That same night, she secretly contacted Detective Morrison. She showed her the messages, the bank evidence, and the recording of the call. Morrison listened silently, unblinking. When Tom's voice came through the speaker saying, "What we built," the detective stopped her. "We're going to use it," she said. Together, they devised a plan. Maggie would pretend to go to the meeting Tom was proposing, record his confession, and buy time for the police to set up around the cabin where they would meet. "We just need him to believe he's still in control," Morrison explained. Maggie nodded. This wasn't the first time she'd dealt with a power freak, but it was the first time she'd gone after him. The meeting was set for Friday evening. The cabin, an old wooden structure in the middle of the woods, had witnessed the clandestine encounters between Harold and Rachel. Now it would be the setting for the denouement. Maggie arrived early, carrying a small bag containing a tape recorder, a flashlight, and a bottle of pills containing only vitamins, but which at first glance looked like sleeping pills. She had also prepared a handwritten letter, a confession, in which she took the blame for Harold's murder, although each line was calculated to provoke specific reactions. While she waited, she heard the sound of dry leaves under the footsteps of two people. Rachel and Tom had arrived. The tension inside the cabin was thick, almost tangible. Rachel, her hair tied back and her gaze cold, was the first to speak. "I never thought you'd go this far, Maggie," she said with mock sadness. Tom, behind her, held a pistol. "Write down what we ask, and it'll all be over soon." Maggie pretended to obey. Tom placed a piece of paper in front of her and a pen, but instead of writing the dictated version, he began composing his own story. He mentioned the digoxin, the policy, the trust, the full names, and the date of each crime. He pretended to tremble, but each word was a bullet. When Rachel tried to read, fury fled her face. "You're lying," she screamed. And just at that moment, the back door burst open. Michael burst into the cabin, followed by Detective Morrison and two armed officers. It all happened in seconds. Tom pointed his gun at Maggie, but the flashlights blinded him. "Put the gun down," Morrison shouted, while Rachel backed away, her hands covered in sweat. In the chaos, the recorder hidden in Maggie's purse continued to capture every word. "She was going to ruin us, we had to," Tom exclaimed, seeking to justify the obvious. Rachel interrupted him with a scream. "You said the drugs were undetectable." The ensuing silence was absolute. That scream was enough. Morrison stepped forward, handcuffed them both, and declared an arrest. The truth, after so much pain, had finally come out. Maggie sat, trembling, watching them be led away. She felt no relief, at least not yet. It was a mixture of exhaustion, anger, and a strange compassion that she didn't know where it came from. Michael knelt in front of her, holding her hands. "You did it, Mom. No one else would have had the courage." She looked up at him, her eyes moist, and replied softly, "It wasn't courage, son. It was survival." Outside, the icy forest wind pounded on the door, as if trying to erase the echoes of everything that had happened inside. But nothing could, because that night, in that cabin, Maggie had buried much more than a family secret. She had buried her own innocence. The following weeks were a whirlwind of interrogations, hearings, and headlines in the local newspapers. The Sullivan case became the talk of Vermont. The cabin. Recordings were accepted as legitimate evidence, and Rachel's spontaneous confession sealed her fate. The court sentenced her to 25 years in prison for intentional homicide and fraud, while Tom received 15 for aiding and abetting and document forgery. Maggie didn't attend the final trial, she preferred to stay home, watching the sunrise over the frozen fields from her window. Justice had come, yes, but at a price no sentence could offset: the final loss of faith in the people she had loved most. Michael moved back to the farm with his son Ethan, trying to rebuild a routine that wouldn't hurt so much. The first few days were strange. The boys' laughter sounded out of place within the walls where so many lies had echoed. Little by little, however, life began to open cracks of light. Maggie found solace in tending the vegetable garden, in the smell of damp earth, and in the small, everyday gestures. Sometimes, when Ethan ran through the field, she would watch him silently and think about all she had endured to protect him. She had lost a husband and a daughter-in-law, but she had regained something far more valuable: the peace of looking at her family without fear. One February morning, while removing frost from the window, Maggie received a letter from the insurance company. The policy money would finally be released in her name after the fraudulent trust was voided. Almost $500,000. She looked at it for several minutes, without joy or euphoria, only with a serenity she'd never known before. She put the letter in a wooden box and a few days later went to the bank. She signed the documents, withdrew a portion, and opened an account in Ethan's name. When the manager asked if she wanted to keep the rest for herself, Maggie smiled. "I don't need that much to live, but my grandson will need a lot to dream." That phrase, spoken without pretense, marked the closing of a cycle that had begun with a lie and ended with an act of love. Detective Morrison visited her one last time. She wore the same gray coat she'd worn the day they'd met, but her expression was different, more human. They sat on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in their hands. "You change the way I look at certain cases," she confided. "Sometimes the truth hides in the quietest places." Maggie nodded, staring at the white-tinged horizon. "The truth doesn't hide, Detective. It's just waiting for someone to hear it." Morrison smiled, and for a moment both women understood that this story wasn't just a closed case, but proof that even broken hearts can be tools of justice when they refuse to give up. With spring came the first green shoots and a different, less heavy silence. Maggie began walking every morning to the old barn, the same one where so many things had happened. For weeks she had thought about tearing it down, burning every trace of that past, but something inside her told her it wasn't necessary. She decided to restore it, with the help of Michael and some neighbors. Remove the rotten boards, paint the walls, give the space back its dignity. Not out of forgetfulness, but out of transformation. Right there, where there had once been pain, they set up a small carpentry shop for Ethan. It was their way of teaching him that places can have second lives just like people. One afternoon, as the sun fell behind the maple trees, Maggie sat in front of the barn and thought about Harold. Not with anger, but with a cleansing melancholy. She understood that love, even the longest, can be warped when it feeds on silence. She had learned that trust isn't destroyed with a single blow, but with tiny cracks that no one notices until the building collapses. But she also understood something deeper, that their story wasn't just one of betrayal, but of resilience. Summer arrived with the smell of freshly cut hay, and the farm was once again alive. Ethan helped his grandmother pick apples, while Michael mended the fence. The boys' laughter mingled with the birdsong, and for the first time in a long time, the air felt lighter. Every day held a measure of redemption, a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal if watered with truth and patience. Maggie would often watch from the porch, a blanket draped over her knees, thinking that perhaps old age wasn't an end, but a second chance to look at the world without illusions, but also without fear. One afternoon, while organizing Harold's old papers, she found a sealed envelope she'd never seen before. On the back, she recognized his handwriting. "For when you don't hate me so much." Her hands trembled. Inside was a short letter, written shortly before his death. Harold spoke of regrets, of decisions he didn't know how to stop, of a mistake that haunted him. He didn't mention names, but his words were a lament. Maggie didn't cry. She put the letter in a drawer and locked it. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken. It's enough to not desire revenge. And that was her choice. To let the past rest, as one lets the earth cover fallen fruit. As the months passed, the farm became a point of curiosity for some neighbors. Many would stop by to say hello. Others simply wanted to see the woman who had unmasked a murder without raising her voice. Maggie smiled at these comments, although deep down she knew there were no heroes in her story, just people trying to survive disloyalty. Some days she gave talks at the local school about financial security and fraud prevention, sharing her experience without naming names. She told the young people that evil doesn't always come with a threatening face, but with polite smiles and sweet promises. Her serenity inspired respect, but also aroused a quiet admiration in others. Ethan grew quickly, curious and sensitive. One afternoon, while they were playing in the restored barn, he asked, "Grandma, why do you always keep that blue notebook on your desk?" Maggie looked at him, smiling. "Because I write down everything I don't want to forget in that notebook," she replied. The boy insisted, "And why don't you read it aloud?" She stroked his hair and said, "Some stories aren't told. They're lived so others don't have to suffer them." That notebook, filled with memories and notes about the darkest days of his life, became his way of preserving his memory without letting pain rule his present. Autumn arrived with a melancholic air, painting the trees in shades of gold and red. Maggie spent more time by the window, knitting scarves while watching the wind sweep the leaves across the path. Life had become slower, more contemplative, but also lighter. Some nights she dreamed of Harold, not with resentment, but with a kind of peaceful distance. In her dreams, he didn't speak. He just looked at her with that mixture of guilt and tenderness that can't exist in the real world. Sometimes Maggie woke up in tears, other times with a tired smile. She learned to accept that certain loves don't fade. They simply change shape until they become memories that no longer hurt. Michael began taking care of the farm business, while Maggie devoted herself to writing short stories about her life, stories she posted on an online personal story forum. She didn't do this to seek attention, but because she understood that sharing what she'd experienced could help others. She wrote about the silent strength, about the dignity of older women that the world often forgets. Her writings began to circulate, and many people contacted her to thank her for her words. She humbly responded, "I'm just sharing what I've experienced." In each story, without directly mentioning it, she left a seed of truth. That pain doesn't define anyone, but the way it is dealt with does. One day in November, a local journalist visited the farm to interview her. She wanted to write an article about women who had faced injustice and moved forward. Maggie agreed, but set one condition. "I don't want to be called a victim or a hero. I was just a woman tired of others deciding for me." During the interview, she spoke with disarming serenity. She recounted how she had survived the mockery, how her faith in herself sustained her when no one else believed. The journalist, moved, asked her what she had learned most from all that. Maggie remained silent for a few seconds and replied, "That the truth doesn't always come when we expect it, but it always comes when we need it most." That phrase ended up printed in the headline of the article, and soon went viral on social media. People from all over the world wrote messages recounting their own experiences of betrayal, justice, or loss. Maggie read them calmly, surprised by how the pain of others could be reflected in so many lives. One afternoon, while scanning the comments, she read one that made her smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, for reminding us that silences also speak." She closed her computer and looked out the window. Snow was beginning to fall, covering everything with a blanket of white. She thought that perhaps life was slowly returning to her, the purity that the lie had stolen. Winter settled back into Vermont like an old friend who never gives notice, bringing short days and long nights. Maggie grew accustomed to the silence interrupted only by the crackling of the fire. Sometimes, While making hot chocolate for Ethan, she found herself thinking about how life had given her back the control so many had tried to take away from her. She no longer felt afraid when she looked back. The past had ceased to be an enemy and had become a lesson. Every corner of the farmhouse held a story, and she had learned to look at them without trembling, with the serenity of someone who no longer owes anything to pain. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the mountains, Maggie sat in front of the fireplace with her blue notebook. She wrote slowly, with the firm handwriting of someone who wants to leave a lasting impression. She didn't write for others but for herself, so as not to forget that even in the darkness, she had found a way to remain herself. On the last page, she wrote, "The truth can destroy, but it also liberates." She closed the notebook and placed it in a box next to a photo of Harold, another of Michael, and a third of Ethan. It was her way of reconciling herself with time. Then she turned off the lamp, and for the first time in years, slept without disturbances. The days slowly began to lengthen, and with them returned the sound of the birds nesting in the restored barn. Maggie woke early, opened the windows, and let in the cool dawn air. Sometimes she thought about writing a book, although she joked that she'd lived long enough to fill an entire library. The truth was, she'd learned to enjoy the stillness, the taste of freshly baked bread, the creaking of the floorboards beneath her footsteps. She no longer needed answers or apologies. She'd found something more important, a peace that depended on no one else. And in that serenity, she found herself more alive than she had been in years. One morning, while she was drinking coffee on the porch, she saw a car pull up in front of the fence. It was Detective Morrison, who had come unannounced. She got out of the vehicle with a discreet smile and a folder in her hand. "I just wanted to deliver this to you in person," she said. Inside was an official note. The case was considered closed, with no charges pending. Morrison looked at her respectfully. Not many people would have had the strength to face something like that with such clarity. Maggie replied with a half-smile. "It wasn't strength, Detective. It was the instinct of someone who grew tired of keeping quiet." They both laughed softly, knowing that phrase was the most accurate definition of the entire story. When the detective left, Maggie stood in front of the gate, watching the car disappear into the snow-covered trees. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the icy wind brush her face. In that instant, she understood that freedom doesn't always come in the form of justice, but rather like a deep breath after a long suffocation. She returned to the house, rekindled the fire, and allowed herself something she had put off for months: laughter. A short, nervous, but genuine laugh. It was her body letting go of fear, her soul acknowledging its own victory. No one else had power over her, and that was a kind of justice no court could grant. That night, as Ethan slept and the house fell silent, Maggie picked up the blue notebook once more. On the first page, she wrote a new title: "Things I Learned When the World Tried to Break Me." Beneath it, in large, firm letters, she jotted, "Never underestimate a woman who has truly loved, because if she survives betrayal, she becomes indestructible." She closed the notebook and placed it on the mantelpiece, next to her family portrait. Then she looked at her reflection in the window, the gray hair, the wrinkles, the serene eyes. She realized she didn't need to erase the past to feel free. It was enough to have faced it without losing herself. The news of the closed case brought an unexpected calm. In the village, people began to greet her with respect, some shyly, others with genuine admiration. Maggie didn't seek recognition, but she appreciated the kind gestures. At the market, a young woman approached her and said, "My mother always says you're proof that there's no age to start over." Maggie smiled, somewhat surprised, and replied, "Your mother is wise. It's never too late to get back on your feet, even if your bones ache a little more." That conversation, so simple and human, moved her more than any article or interview. It was confirmation that her story had transcended pain and become a shared strength. The days continued to pass, and with them the certainty that she had recovered not only her name, but her voice. On Sunday afternoons, she used to sit under the old maple tree with Ethan, telling him stories about her youth and the summers with Harold. The good ones, the ones still worth remembering. "Do you still miss him?" the boy asked her once. Maggie thought for a few seconds before answering. Missing him doesn't always mean wanting to go back. Sometimes it just means you learned something that was too hard for you. Ethan looked at her, not fully understanding, but he hugged her arm tenderly. In that gesture, Maggie felt that everything had been worth it. Every tear, every scary night, every truth discovered. As winter faded, Maggie decided to throw a small family dinner to celebrate Michael's birthday. She invited a few neighbors and baked her famous apple pie, the same one Harold used to praise. The evening was peaceful, filled with soft laughter and simple conversation. At one point, someone played an old song on the radio, one of those tunes that seems to take you back to places that no longer exist. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment and let the music fill the room. She didn't feel nostalgia, but gratitude, for having survived, for still standing, for having learned that life, even after disaster, still offers sweetness. That night, after saying goodbye to everyone, she stepped out onto the porch wrapped in her favorite shawl. The air smelled of damp wood and the promise of spring. She looked up at the sky and saw a cluster of stars so bright that for a moment she thought she heard her mother's voice saying that happy endings don't always come with fanfare, but with silences that no longer hurt. Maggie smiled. She knew her story wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And in that act of owning it, of not hiding it or idealizing it, she found her freedom. She closed the door behind her and let the night envelop her, as if the universe, at last, had granted her rest. At dawn, Maggie awoke to the sound of a rooster and the soft light coming through the curtains. She dressed slowly, made coffee, and went out to explore the farm. Every corner now held a different meaning. The repaired fences, the restored barn, the scent of damp earth. Everything spoke of rebuilding. She thought of the women who, like her, had been underestimated because of their age, their silence, or their apparent fragility. She wanted her story to be of use to them, to those who still believe there is no time to start over. And she understood that true justice is not found in the courts, but in being able to look in the mirror and not feel ashamed of what they have experienced. Holding the blue notebook in her hands, Maggie wrote its final lines before putting it away forever. I survived betrayal, loneliness, and lies, but I also survived the version of myself that was afraid to be strong. Then she closed the notebook, placed it on the table, and took a deep breath. Outside, the sun rose slowly, illuminating the maple fields she loved so much. Ethan ran among them, laughing while Michael waved to her from the fence. Maggie smiled with the calm certainty of someone who has made peace with her history. Life, she thought, owed her nothing, and for the first time she owed life nothing either.